So I can hear. So I can't pace. Change the source. I'm in here. There it is. Okay. Whew. Good to go. Okay. Okay, let's hit it. Just a quick introduction. I met most of you, but I'm Izzy Kleinhendler. I work at an MSP here in Lakewood Data Link Systems. I don't know exactly everybody's level. I'm going to try not to bore you. If it's too simple, try not to be too overcomplicated. So we'll try to get something right in the middle, and we'll feel it out based on feedback. So anybody who wants to chime in, feel free. The topic is it even worth migrating to the cloud? It was a different topic I had a little while back, and I tweaked it post-COVID because being on-prem was a big pain point. So a lot of people were scrambling. Everybody pretty much was scrambling to find solutions. And we're going to look at some of these common solutions, some of the options, and weigh them and see what makes the most sense. Okay, so pretty much the way we're going to look at it: quick history, quick overview of what I call the traditional deployments or the classic, which means what everybody's been doing for the last long while. Talk about some of the newer options. When I say new, it doesn't have to mean last year, but newer compared to the typical on-premise setup that pretty much everybody had. We're going to compare them pretty thoroughly. We'll maybe talk about mixing and matching some hybrid options, drop a couple of examples, and then just a word about maybe where we're headed with all of this. Okay, so every company has a different size. They have a different setup, and they have different needs. So who are we going to talk about? So just to make the points I want to make, I chose a use case. Now, I work in the MSP, in the SMB space. I work for an MSP, so pretty much SMBs are the customers we're dealing with. So I thought it made the most sense for me to talk about SMBs. But what is an SMB? And so before, when I was preparing this, I did some Googling, and there's 200 opinions. I combined them together into two, and you see how not exact it is. So you have people say, anything less than 50 is not an SMB. That's just Soho, small potatoes. And then after 500 already, that's already, you're getting into enterprise territory. People say from 0 to 1,000, or what I put here, 1 to 1,000. So there's no rule about who's considered the enterprise and who's considered a little, basement operation. It's more of what you do than how many employees you actually have. But for the purpose of this talk, I want you to understand that we're talking about not a tiny operation, but not Chase Bank either. Okay? So this is the case. This is the scenario I'm going to build up, and I chose this size because the decision is tricky. Okay, so I chose, sometimes the decision is obvious. This is kind of tough. So we have a company that has 100 employees. They have 70 employees that come to the office, that come to work, and they have 30 remote employees. Okay, so they're not tiny. They're serious. But their workflow is on the more simple side. Okay, so let's just say they have a DC, file server, maybe an application server with a couple of different locally hosted programs, and a terminal server for the other the 30 remote. Okay, so again, they're a pretty sizable workforce, I think I would say, but they're not doing a ton. They don't have 20 servers like you might see in a company, maybe even half the size of that. But obviously, it's very important, and if things are down, it's 100 people with nothing to do, and somebody's paying their salary. Okay, so, and you'll see it's going to be a little tricky. So the use case here is a single server running Hyper-V with, doesn't have to be Hyper-V, but let's just say, with 4 virtual machines. So kind of put that in the back of your mind, and let's see where that goes. Okay, so we're gonna start off, run through a little bit of the history, and obviously if you're virtualizing, you're obviously using either Hyper-V or ESXi, VMware, vSphere. So let's just run real quickly through the history of what this looked like. So I'm going back. Let's go back. Let's take it back 20 years, right? Let's go to server 03. So pretty much the way it looked is people this size had a single machine, had a single box, a single server. Obviously not everybody, but many. Or at least put it this way, they crammed as much as they could on a single machine. Group policy was king. That was pretty much the beginning, middle, and that's how you controlled everything. Batch files were everywhere. I don't know if people can relate to this, but it's all startup scripts and login and net use delete, net use map this drive, and that's just what everybody was having. It was common for the servers to handle DHCP, the domain controller. I don't know why. I don't get the big plus of that. Maybe somebody could explain to me one day. When your domain control is down, it's just another thing that affects all the people that don't need to be on your domain. But that's just what I see on all the old setups. Backup solutions weren't great if you had one. If it got everything, it was a good chance it wasn't even off-site. If you had multiple LANs, like maybe you wanted to segregate your networks, it was done physically. Think Sonical, think XO and X0 and X2 or something, right? Things were totally separated. And then we started getting a little more high tech. Okay, think server 08 already, right? Hyper-V, not even everybody was on ESXi basically back, like I don't know, ESXi 5 if I'm talking your language. People started breaking up the workloads. You might have multiple virtual machines now, not everything on a single box. And by the way, I don't think it's crazy to tell you that I used to see a DC that was also a terminal server. Like they bought a box and they filled it up, and that's just how it was. So people were running to vSphere, Hyper-V. They started using more virtual machines. Cloud backups became more common. VLANs became a thing, right? Tagging your switches, making VLANs guest networks instead of physically wiring things separately. And the last comment here is just that wireless became very, very important. Meaning we see think nursing home, think EMR, right? People went off paper. People went on Wi-Fi. You have carts. I mean, it's not only healthcare, but that's just the easiest example. And it went from being a convenience to being critical. Right? So that's kind of how, in 2 minutes, kind of how our networks evolved. Here's a typical setup you might see in a single location place. So you might have something like a Dell PowerEdge, RAID 5, 6, 10, something like that. Maybe Hyper-V with a couple of VMs, a couple of GPOs, maybe a terminal server, RDS server for your remote users, which is going to be, let's say, our case that I'm building up here. You have file and full VM backup that became, you're running, whatever it is, Altaro, VM, whatever, Acronis, whatever you use. You have some smart switches, some VLANs, full wireless coverage, not just in the busy areas. And people who needed to get in remotely were RDPing. Either ports were open, which obviously a mistake, or maybe you have a VPN and then you RDP, or maybe you have two-factor authentication with something like Duo. People, you had your RMM monitoring everything, and I'm pointing this out because when you start dispersing the way you manage this has to change. And the key here is that there were few recurring costs. So you bought your stuff, you bought your server, you licensed everything, and then you just squeezed it to the last drop. Okay, and your recurring charges weren't much. Let's say you throw a couple of other sites, satellite offices, a couple of other locations. Okay, no big deal. You throw in a couple of site-to-site VPNs. Maybe you'll keep a DC in your primary location, maybe a secondary, maybe a read-only in one or two of your others or whatever it is. What happens? You're hosting applications in your primary location. So what do people do who are remote? No big deal, right? They'll log on locally. They'll log on to a terminal server or something like that, so that they can access the local stuff. You might have files everywhere, some stuff here, some stuff on that location, keep latency down, and maybe because you're bigger, you're locked down tighter with lots of GPUs. Okay, that was quick, but I think this is pretty common. I think this is something that we all see a lot of. Okay, I did a little quick shopping before I came here, and this is what a setup like this might look like. Now, I think I went middle of the road. Now, you can definitely go cheaper than this. But you could definitely go way beyond. So take a look at this. I priced out a PowerEdge R550, which is middle of the road, but it's new, right? So you're gonna pay for that. 2 gold CPUs, 2 Intel Xeon Gold CPUs, 8 cores each, 128 gig of RAM, SSDs, so you're paying for that. But with I think I calculated 4 terabytes usable storage in a RAID 10. Okay, so again, you could definitely go cheaper than that. Right, the example would be, let's say 4 2 terabyte drives, right? In a RAID 10 will get you almost 3.5 for user, and it's not cheap. 17 grand. You could get one for 7, I know, or less. But this is a powerful machine. But again, it's your one machine that's going to do all your heavy lifting. Okay, for the backup solution, I went cheap. Get a Synology on site, and here's your $18,000 setup. Not talking about networking equipment or anything like that. Okay. Now I mix in another license here because we're going to see how, as you change models, your licensing changes. So what do people do for their email? What do people do for Office? And let's just say they're with Microsoft Office 365, and they have the business standard, which costs $12.50 a month per license. It's a pretty common license. You get your Exchange Online Plan 1. You get your SharePoint, OneDrive, whatever comes with that, and you get your Office applications. They're changing the rates in a month, right? It was supposed to be today, but I think they changed it. I got an email this morning. Okay, so your monthly costs are low. $12.50 for 100 employees is not bad at all. Which over 5 years comes out, just because we're going to compare it to other subscriptions, over 5 years that comes out to $75K in your subscriptions. And your total 5-year cost is in the low 90s. Okay. Well, what else is there? And what is driving that? So why would we want anything different? Your server gets old, just buy a new one, do it again. And there's many reasons, there are many factors here, but the ones I want to point out and I want to highlight, and they might sound funny to you, is number one, the need to collaborate remotely. So that's obvious. When everything's in a single office location, and then people need to work remote, it's a challenge. All of a sudden, you used to have 30 people with VPNs, and now you need 100 or something like that. That's a challenge. You might not be able to accommodate that. But you had 30 people logging into a server. Well, what are you going to do now? They're all going to log into that same server. You might not be able to handle it. So number one, the need to collaborate remotely became a challenge for keeping everything on-prem. Number two, this is the one that I think some of you might think is a little odd, is a distaste for physical servers. Now, I'm not kidding. This drives decisions. Cannot tell you how many times people tell me, get the server out of my office. I don't want to see it. When can I get rid of it? Isn't everything in the cloud nowadays? People don't want to have, they don't want, either it's the responsibility or the headache or the noise or the electric bill. It's mostly a mindset. Why do we still need these servers? And that'll make them push you to come up with alternatives, or at least offer them, propose alternatives that don't involve them buying a new server. And now, obviously, thanks to the last 2 years, we have reluctance to invest in hardware in unknown times. Even though, for the most part, people have been back to work for a long time, people still think, what if we have to go home again? What if this? What if that? I don't want to be so dependent on my office. So these are some of the factors. I'm not even talking about if you outgrew what you have. Let's just say the size stayed the same. So option number one, and I'm kind of going to generalize here, is you could take your workload and put it in the cloud. The big boys are AWS and Azure. And just a quick background on what that's like in case you're not familiar with these services. They work with pay-as-you-go models. So basically you pay for what you're using, when you're using it, by the hour, sometimes by the minute. There's no upfront cost, which is a big plus. There's unlimited resources, so you don't have to worry about outgrowing the box that you have in the office. Operating system licensing is included unless you change that, but out of the by default that's how it works, which is just less of a headache. You want to turn on some machines and maybe you don't want them in a month or two, no problem. You don't have that headache of the licensing. It's highly available, which means that hopefully it's not going to go down, but we've seen some. And you have tremendously powerful tools at your disposal that you will never have in your office, which we're going to enumerate a little bit later. So let's take our same company now. Let's look at what this looks like when you're setting this up in the cloud. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to lift what they call lift and shift. So you're going to take your machines just the way they are, and you're going to upload them to the cloud and start running them there. If you're in AWS, it's EC2. That's the service. Maybe you are backing up your files to S3, which is very cheap. And you could very easily take snapshots of your machines on a schedule that you choose every couple of hours, once a day, whatever it is. Choose how long you want to keep them. It's pretty cheap to do that. You don't need to think about space. How long? What's going to happen if I grow around a space? So the built-in backup solutions are very easy to use, very easy to set up. But everything is in the cloud. So what happens if you do need to connect to on-prem? So you got to go back to VPNs or direct connect or something similar, which is where you're gonna actually have a connection straight into the cloud. Which, believe it or not, even at Lakewood you can get that. Well, what are the people gonna work on if everything's in the cloud? So there's a couple of options. The two obvious ones are either you're gonna have a terminal server again, meaning a big machine that everybody's logging into. Or you're going to use something like Amazon Workspaces, which is picking up, where you have desktop as a service. You have your cloud workstation. It's really a server. It's a Windows server. You're not allowed to license Windows 10 machines in the cloud. Nobody does it except for Microsoft. But even until recently, they didn't do it. So it has to be a server, which comes with some drawbacks because Windows 10 does have some flexibility that you don't find on a server. In my case, I'm going to stick with the workspaces because it's obviously cheaper than a humongous terminal server or a server farm. So I'm going to stick with that. And then if you have a predictable workload, you can reserve. You can reserve for a year or for 3 years and get a nice discount on that. So that's the way to make it more affordable. That's just kind of what the setup is going to look like. Doesn't matter if you have a single site, multiple sites, pretty much everything goes to the cloud and you connect to it from anywhere, however you're connecting. So here's my little effect on the price tag. Let's look at what this might cost. So let's say you have a small domain controller, 2 CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM, 50 gig drive, something like that. I calculated disk space, some basic backup space and whatever. It'll run you about $70 a month. A file server with 4 CPU cores, 16 gigs of RAM, a terabyte, closer to the 500. An application server that, let's just say it's working hard, 8 cores, 32 gigs of RAM. You're up another $100 there. Amazon Workspaces. So I picked the size that has 2 cores, 8 gig of RAM. So it can work for many. And those cost $50 a month. That's a big chunk right there. And I stuck with your same office license. So your monthly cost goes from what it was before, $1,250, to over $7,000. But you don't have to buy the server. You don't have to commit to anything. You can turn it off when you want. You can make it bigger when you want, or whatever it is. Total monthly cost is $7,350. Your total 5-year cost, if you multiply that by 60 months, is $440,000, which is that's already money, right? So then we have this new trendy thing called serverless, and how does that work? So just a quick background on serverless. Now there's many serverless services, but we're going to talk about the ones that we might be using in our environment. So first of all, it's fully managed. So you don't have to. You don't touch any servers. Actually, everything's taken care of for you. There's no maintenance, and your email account is your identity, which basically means you sign in with you. It's not just to get your email. It's also the way you access your files. It's also the way you log into your computer and everything else. So this is your identity. So let's take the same scenario and let's try it on with our serverless. So your personal files are going to get moved to OneDrive, right? So we go from, let's say, a file server or folder redirection or something like that. They move to OneDrive. Your shared data goes to SharePoint, which is Microsoft's file server. You create sites. That's just a technicality. You don't make multiple file shares. You need to make sites. If anybody's used that, you know what I'm talking about. There's easy migration tools. You push it all right up there. You join your computers to Azure AD, so you no longer need domain controllers. And you manage it with Microsoft's MDM, which is Intune. Okay, so your policies, your software deployments, your compliance, whatever it is that you're doing, happens through this. So it's a fully managed service. What I forget, where you're putting your applications, but we'll put that on the side for a second. That's just not an option with this. Okay, so when you do that, you need to up your license because you need to have a P1 or whatever it might be. And I moved from here to the $20 license for Business Premium. Okay, so you get with that is you get your email, you get your SharePoint, your OneDrive, your Microsoft Office applications. You get access to join your computers to Azure AD. You get advanced threat protection, which is the security, email security scanning. There's just a lot of stuff that they pack it. It's for small businesses. There's a limit of 300 licenses. Then you need to go enterprise and pay 32 for the same thing. But the point is, this is pretty enticing. Again, $2,000 a month is more than you're paying when you're on-prem, but it's not that much more. Okay, so this is kind of a generalized overview of what you can do, right? So yeah, you could go back to on-prem and get another server. You could try to push everything to the cloud, or you could try to go with some kind of a serverless option. So let's try to really dig in and see which one makes sense for us. Obviously, the cost we already threw out there, so I'm sure everybody's thinking, oh, cloud's expensive. But let's look at let's what else? Let's talk technical for a second. Okay, so what's good about on-prem? Number one, it's well established. It's well documented. You could find help online. It's been around for a while. It's more stable. You can right. So I alluded to that. You have a problem. You had all those web apps that used to be sitting on your server that now have nowhere to go, which means that you're forced to find another solution. As you were hosting some software locally. You now have to get another subscription. Some cloud-based software that's going to replace what you had because you don't have any server to install anything, which is a big right there that could knock it right out for many people. But we're going to come back to that. So you have full control over your users, over your data. You have your group policy, which speaks a lot. NTFS permissions. Is it fair to say there's no second to NTFS? You could have file servers, print servers. It's very easy to just throw up servers because it's on the same hardware that you have. You could easily host any application, few recurring costs, no need to skimp on resources / it's cheap to overspec. And what that means is it's so easy to just make machines that have extra CPU, extra RAM, extra disk space, provided that you have the room on your server. It's super easy to overspec. And when people move to the cloud, a lot of times they have to be exact because you're paying for what you use, and they don't. All of a sudden, they have to start thinking about, what do I need that? Do I not need that? So over here, it's just easy to throw resources at any problem that comes your way. Major changes aren't frequent. Assuming you're not upgrading your OS or whatever it is. You could easily log into local resources. For some people, that might not be a big deal. For me, it is. You have phones, you have printers, scanners, all kinds of things that need local web access. Well, when there's no local, it's just a challenge. That you could solve that problem by putting a computer there or something that you use to get into the network. It's just another hiccup when you are on premise, you don't have these problems because you already have local stuff. Somebody else needs to put some software, some monitoring software, access control software, whatever it is. You have a place to put anything, and I don't underestimate that. So what's the downside? What's the downside of sticking with this? So obviously there's the big upfront cost, right? If you're buying a server, upgrades are not always possible. So yes, maybe you could upgrade, throw in a couple more drives. Maybe you could put in more RAM. At some point, you outgrow what you have. it's hard to scale out. So where in the cloud, it's just very easy to just make tons of machines or whatever it is. When you have a server, you can scale up. You can make it more powerful. You can make it bigger. But when it comes to scaling out and making multiples, it's hard to do. Which means, okay, so you want some redundancy. You want a load balance. Okay, well, hold on a second. So you have to go buy another box, another $17,000 server, or whatever it might be. So it's hard to scale out. Enterprise grade hardware is not affordable for most. So it means you're going to be cut compared to the quality that you'll get in a data center. You're not going to get that here. It requires the physical office, which could be a challenge, or like we said, for whatever the reason, people don't want to rely on that. There's reliance on VPNs to connect to the office, which, depending on where you are, people suffer from that terribly sometimes. Reliance on a central location, having no downtime. So what happens if the ISP goes out? Well, maybe where you are, you don't have another option. What if there's a power outage? Well, does your building have a generator? Does it not? And so whatever could possibly go wrong in a single place is going to affect all your people that are not there. So as long as everybody was in the office, it worked. Once the people start spreading out, it's not a great option anymore. Remote work can obviously be challenging, and it's hard to collaborate, especially externally. We get this all the time. People want to, I have a folder with 200 gig in it. How could I share it? Who do you need to share it with? My lawyer. I don't know. You could put it in SharePoint. You could put it in a Dropbox. You could give them a login. There's no built-in easy way, and I don't count work folders, by the way, as being an easy option. There's no good setup to share your on-prem data. That's kind of yesterday's way of thinking. Today, people expect to just be able to share everything. You have somebody who doesn't have IT, and he could share things with whoever he wants because he has a Dropbox account. And now you tell him that here on your server with your big fancy setup, you can't share files. How does it work? So these are some of the challenges we have here. Okay, so how's the cloud? Is it better? So the pros are it's highly available. It's very reliable. It's not supposed to go down. Anybody can get to it from anywhere. There's unlimited resources. You never have to think that you're going to outgrow anything. You don't need VPNs, assuming that all your work is in the cloud. It's great for multiple locations and users on the go. You can run your own servers and maintain the same full control that you could do when you're on-prem, same group policies and all that, everything that comes with it. Best-in-class tools and resources at your disposal. I mean, if you've ever used the monitoring tools, things like CloudWatch, things like CloudFormation, there's so many good tools at your disposal that you just simply don't have when you're on-prem. It's very easy to audit. You want to know who made a change on your network in your office. Go figure that out. That's not an easy task. Who logged into your switch? I don't know. Go find it. You need special tools for that. Do it in the cloud. It's just so easy to audit. So easy. Everything is logged. Everything's there for you to see. And just I want to say a word about workspaces. Again, this for those who haven't used it's their desktop option. So first of all, to deploy them is just painless. You could deploy it's the same amount of effort to deploy 1,000 as it is to deploy one. And there's low latency access to everything there. So if you're relying on a VPN or something like that, so hold on a second, you're accessing things over a VPN, that's going to be slow. But when you're on a workspace, all your work is being executed in the cloud. It's much better. It's much faster. You could access from any device for the Mac people out there, for the people in the browser who like to work on their browser, people who want to get, they have, from a tablet, whatever you have, you can connect to your workspace. And that's very enticing to a lot of people, especially people who travel. And kind of a benefit is that you could cut down on your hardware for your end users, and they even make PCOIP. I don't know if anybody's ever dealt with this. They make PC over IP is the protocol. It's similar to RDP, and they make PCOIP thin clients that only connect to things like Amazon Workspaces, VMware, which is pretty cool. So now instead of buying $1,000 computers, maybe you could cut down to $400 computers. So where you're paying here, you might be able to get savings somewhere else. What's the downside? You don't have local network access. That was my complaint before. So if you do have things stored locally, somebody needs help configuring something on the network, you got to start making sessions with them, or you have to have another computer there, so you kind of still have a server there. Scanning is a pain in the neck. People want to scan to folder. Well, hold on a second. Can you do that? Well, if you're doing RDP, then you have to redirect your C drive. If you have a workspace, you can't do it. So that means you have to copy it from here, paste it there. These are just different challenges that come your way that people took for granted on-prem. Latency can be, if you have a poor connection, everything. We've had people who said, when I move the mouse, there's a delay, right? Because they have a terrible connection. Everything they do is being done remote. So they move their mouse and they watch it trail behind them. That's obviously not going to work for somebody. It requires technicians familiar with cloud deployments. Not that it's harder to do, but it's different. It's not what most of us start with. It's not what most of us are used to. So you need techs that maybe you have an office with 20 techs in the MSP world. Maybe only 5 of them know the cloud. So that all of a sudden the people who could support it are, shrinks. That's just a challenge on our side. And then obviously the cost can be rough, as we've seen. It costs a lot to go on the cloud. Now, by the way, as a general rule, the bigger you are, the more worth it is to go to the cloud. That's kind of the rule of thumb. In other words, if you're a 20-man shop, a 50, even my case, is very expensive to go to the cloud. But when you're very big and your hardware doesn't cost $17,000, it costs $700,000, then it does make sense to go to the cloud. So that's kind of where you see the difference. Okay, and finally, the serverless setup. What are the pros? There's no need for physical service or an office at all. Low startup costs. It's easy to access from anywhere. You could collaborate. You could share because everything's in OneDrive and SharePoint. Everything's cloud-based. It's easy to manage your devices from anywhere. MDM, Intune, like we said before, is. I'll say a word about Intune in a minute. But the fact is, you have it. You have some level of control using the Intune. It's easy to create security baselines and things like that. So you want to make a compliance policy and just see in a nice, on one page, who's compliant, who's not compliant, which machines got the software deployed, which didn't. It's much, much easier to do this in the cloud, in Intune, than it is to do it when you're deploying it on-prem. And the same thing, same point about auditing. What are the downsides of this? So first of all, there's no group policy. There's Intune policy. Leave it at that. There are no batch files. So we talked about people just overusing batch files. You can't do that in Intune. You have to use PowerShell scripts. Now with some extra work, you could get some scripts to run, but it's extra work. You can't just do your simple tasks that took no effort before. There's no NTFS. There are permissions, but it's not NTFS. It's a royal pain. There's sync issues. What could go wrong? What could go wrong if you're using SharePoint? Sync issues. That's what goes bad. And it could be a nightmare. You could have people work on things for hours, and they think it's auto-saved. And then you get a little warning, unable to sync changes, save it as with another name or whatever they tell you to do. But somebody else was also working on that file, and they made their own changes that couldn't sync. So who gets to fix that? So this is what can go bad. I guess this happened to 1 or 2 people. This is what can go bad with the SharePoint. Now it doesn't have to go bad. By the way, just a public service announcement: CSVs don't autosave. As somebody was complaining that their CSVs, everybody's working on CSVs, and they all have a different version. Only Excel's autosave, not CSVs in SharePoint. You have nothing on your local network. So let's say you need to log into switches, phones, printers. There's nothing there. Which depending on who you are, translates into everything needing to be cloud-based. So you have more flexibility when you can host things locally. And now you can't host anything locally because there's no local. It's newer, buggy technology. I think that's fair to say that. It's difficult to deploy printers. What used to be a no-brainer to push out a printer with group policy, now you need third-party tools. There's Universal Print. The hot thing now is Printix. But first of all, you pay per user. Pay per license, you pay per user, per printer. It's a cloud-based print service that you need to use in order to push printers to your end users. Printix, Printix. I think the Universal Print is like $5 a user, something crazy. The Printix is like $2, but still, it's just what was built in and easy to use just no longer works for you. Scanning is a challenge or impossible. Now, some of the big copiers, they have, I know, for example, Ricoh, they make a paid module where you could scan right into SharePoint. Okay, but again, that's just another thing that stopped working for you. You could do scan to email, but depending on what you do, we've had people, complain about how every time they scan to email, they have to drag it in, they forget, they're missing stuff. People want things to work, at least as well as the way they're working the old-fashioned way, so to speak. That's it's just one of those things you need to think about. Some people don't scan, but some people scan a ton, and it's a problem. The licensing goes up, obviously, and you have to explain to decision makers why it makes sense to jump from $4 a month to $20. Well, what do you mean? I was doing fine with that, and depending on who you are, some people are going to get you on. They're not going to like that. So, is there an alternative to group policy? Because that really everything that I said boils down to group. Everything can be done with group policy. Well, what's the alternative? So, I have a little side-by-side comparison here. I'm almost done with this section here. So, first of all, folder redirection. Most of us probably use folder redirection. You take all your files from all your end users and you redirect it to a single location. First of all, you could access something from a single. You could move data around easily. You could back everything up from a single location. Many benefits. Pretty obvious what the benefits of that is. Well, what do you get? What do you get with Intune? You get files on demand, which is basically OneDrive where they'll redirect your desktop documents and pictures. Now, you could play games and try to redirect other folders, but it's not built in, it's not supported, and it comes with its own headaches. There was a time when I thought it was a good idea. I backed off. And then wait hours to sync, and then when it stops syncing, you have to resync. Okay, printing. We already spoke about printing. Printer deployment's a piece of cake. The universal print is expensive, and the fact is it just takes a lot longer to set up. One of the downsides on-prem is you can't work on files simultaneously, which is something that some people got used to. For example, think Google Docs, Google Sheets. People who come from that environment, they're used to it. Intune you can, which also often comes with the sync issues, which I just mentioned. There's no great option on-prem for sharing data externally, which is great for security, right? Everything's locked down, but it's not practical. With Intune you can, with SharePoint you can, and if you want to have some control over it, you can control it with policy. So you could not allow external sharing. You could allow only guests, only existing guests. There's a couple of options on that. Okay, startup scripts, logon scripts are effortless on-prem. PowerShell scripts are your only option when you're joined to Azure AD. Software installation, easy, multiple ways to do it, no big deal. In the cloud, it can be done if you have the MSI that's, an unattended installer works. Anything more complicated already takes a lot more work. Map drives, nothing to it. This is my real pet peeve, this one. What happens when you try to map SharePoint? Officially, I've never got it, by the way. I know some people have. I've never got it to work. According to the official documentation, it takes 8 hours to sync. I've waited 8 hours, many 8 times 8. It didn't work. And just think about that for a second. If you're lazy on-prem, 90 minutes later it'll show up. Right? Group policy kicks in every 9 minutes without a GP update, which doesn't require a log over. Here, if you're lucky, you'll get it in 8 hours. I mean, come on. It's a big step back for me. File permissions, you have NTFS with Windows Server. File permissions, I just wrote annoying here. There are permissions, they do exist, but they're a nightmare. And you have to go to one place to make security groups. Then you have to add your users in. Then you have to go to another place to add the security group to the site. And then you have to go to a third place in the advanced settings to actually go ahead and adjust what permissions the people in that group with the access have. It's a difference between seconds to minutes, which for some of us, it's all the difference. BitLocker is where they win. Okay, if you need to deploy BitLocker, doing it locally, storing the keys in Active Directory, it's a job. Do it in the cloud. There's nothing to it. You turn it on, it goes. The keys are stored there. It just starts encrypting on its own. They won that battle. Other GPOs. What about you want to push out Chrome GPOs? You grab the ADMX files. If anybody's ever done that, you throw it in, check, you're done. It's a longer process in it. So long story short, they have policies. They tried to copy. They just ain't there yet, and maybe they will be soon. But it works, but it's a downgrade. How's the difference in security? On-prem, we have remote login. So how do you get into your computer if you're not there? So you can RDP. Maybe you have Duo. Maybe you have a VPN. Maybe you have all of the above. In Amazon, you have a workspace client. Okay, so you have to either install the client or use the browser. It's just a different way of accessing it. In Azure AD, there's nothing to log into. On-prem, you're responsible for your hardware and your OS maintenance. In AWS, it's just the OS. Hardware is not on you, which please don't underestimate that. Azure AD, there is nothing again for you. Monitoring on-prem is difficult. It gets easier and finally easiest in Azure AD. Again, the tools available for monitoring, the dashboards that you can make, the analytics is just fantastic. I want to say that Microsoft wins that one. You want to know who's trying to log in from where. In a second, you could figure everything out. When you do it on-prem, either you can't, or you have the tools in place so you can, but you got to start sifting and looking and digging, and it's not an easy thing to do. And a lot of times people just give up and say, all right, we'll close things up, we'll tighten it up, or we don't know what happened, just reset your password. That kind of mentality, you have much greater visibility with some of these other tools. What's the networking like? So when you're on-prem, all your data is local. You have to be careful to segregate your guests from your corporate data. You have to prioritize VoIP, right? QoS. You might need bandwidth control if you're pushing, backups off-site, things like that. So basically, you gotta. If you have a small environment, it doesn't matter. But if you have a bigger environment, you need to, you got to take care of your network. In the cloud, it's a little less. When I say the networking, I'm not talking about the networking in the cloud. It's a little less on-prem. On the cloud side, it requires a little bit more expertise. It goes back to knowing subnetting, things that you don't really need to be busy with on-prem. By default, there's no NAT, which is an interesting point. I don't know if this has ever bothered anybody. By default, when you make a virtual machine in the cloud, it has a WAN IP, has a public IP. So in the office, everything's going out of your gateway, and you have a single IP. Now you can do that in the cloud, but that means having public subnets, private subnets, and sending the traffic from your private subnet to an instance in your public subnet, or having a NAT gateway. All these kind of things, it's just a little bit more complex, and it comes with certain challenges that you don't. It's just when you just have a router and you throw devices on your network, you don't need to think about. Your local network is not as important because none of the work is being done there. In Azure AD, what networking do you need? None. All you need is an internet connection. There's nothing happening, not here, not there. Everything is just, software as a service. Some final notes. More techs are familiar with this technology, the on-prem. It's easier to get away with mistakes. I don't know if it's fair to say. Bad practices, you could kind of get by. Let's say your firewall. It's an old mindset. Group policy. Turn the firewalls off. We want everything to work. But if you do that on your public-facing machines in the cloud, you might end up in a little bit of trouble. People have loose file permissions. You can't access it? Okay, everyone, all, right? It's something that just works a little bit easier locally. It's a little bit more forgiving. Now, again, if you open up a port, until one machine is compromised, the ship goes down. But the fact is, this is just, I think, historically how it's been. People, you put your firewall, let's just say all ports are closed, and you feel like you're protected. So yeah, we all know each other. We don't around here. Everybody gets along. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Until they could access the financial information. That happens sometimes. But for the most part, people, you can get away with a little bit more. It's not a good thing, but I think it's just how it is. How about in AWS? Because everything's accessed remotely, a mistake will expose your servers to all. So you open up the wrong port on your NACL, on your access control list. You make a mistake with a security group. You put something in a public subnet when you thought we were putting it in a private subnet. You might just be exposing everything. And by the way, just the icing on the cake is that AWS, Azure IPs, their IP blocks are known to all. You can look it up, and they get hammered more than a robot that's scanning every IP will get to you too. But you're not being targeted exclusively like Amazon is. So you really have to just be a little. There's no forgiveness if you make a mistake there. In Azure AD, conditional access into an ATP DLPs pretty much gets you covered. So conditional access is where you could just block logins from all countries, just like that, US only. Now, why can't these guys in Somalia figure out how to just do it from here? The fact is they don't. Most of them don't. So your attack surface shrinks by whatever to almost 300 countries you could block. Intune, those are the policies we have. Advanced threat protection, that'll be your email scanning, your attachment scanning, your link scanning. Data loss prevention if you need. It's more of a compliance thing. If you email a social security number, encrypt, things like that. You make a few policies, you're pretty much good to go. So the ease of use here is by far the easiest. Okay, let's just put it all together, wrap it up. So we have our cost comparison. Small setup, 100 users on-prem, 100% on-prem. So we talked about buying the server, $17K. Monthly recurring cost is down a little over $1,000. 5 years down the road, not considering everything else, you're at $93K. All right, what happens when you're Azure AD join? All you do is you pay for your license. There's nothing else. It's a little more expensive. Okay, what happens if you go to AWS? Shoot, that's a jump. Okay, we're in the the $2,000 range. We're jumping to $7,000, much more expensive. And your total cost is going to be much higher. Okay, so yeah, go. Where are they logging into? Where are they doing the work? RDS will cost you more unless you really skip on. Yeah. Tell me how you would. How would you build it? No, give me a ballpark. We'll try to figure it out. How much RAM? Right, the big resource you need is RAM, right? And the terminal. So how much RAM for 100 users? If you could get 60, two machines. Okay, so all right, 128. That's your minimum. That means people have to scrape by on a gig. Depends on what they're doing. That's tight. Now, by the way, big corporations, they do that. They just do VDI. I'm telling you that. I'm here to tell you that's tight. If my guys would not be happy with that. They would complain all day. I would double that. I would put 4 64 gig machines probably. What would you say? It would be torture. You got to know. Listen. If everybody is, all they do is they go to one website, and let's sit there all day and do nothing else, that could work. But if they're actually working, they're doing email, they have multiple tabs open in the browser, they have Chrome with one. Right. If you're using Chrome, you're done for. So let's say. So I'll tell you this. I priced it out. I priced out putting 100 users on a terminal server farm of 25 users on 4 machines with 64 gig each. That's maybe a little generous, but not very generous. Okay, it costs about $4,000 or so a month to run something like that, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, now throw in their RDS cals. Is how much a piece? How much is an RDS cal? 145 a piece times 100. That's 15K. On top of that, and then if you're using Office, if you go subscription, you have to get the enterprise license or an open license. You have to get the $12 license. They don't activate it on shared activation. Doesn't work. No. So by the time you're done, listen. You could make the argument that you could go leaner. I think you can. I would faster give everybody a workspace that's half the size with 4 gig of RAM and try my luck on that before I would dump everybody. Well, come with an alternative by all means. I think this is the easier way to do it. Required to have workstations. Again, what's the scenario? The way I'm going with the cloud is that there is no local network. Nothing's local. meaning everybody works at home, everybody works from home, and they sign into their workspace or their terminal server. Okay, and let's just, for argument's sake, assume that the pricing with the terminal server is the same or more. It doesn't have to be. Okay, so I think what we need to do here, because just being on-prem has too many drawbacks. Just being in the cloud is too expensive. Just doing Azure, you're limited. You can't run any applications. So you need to mix and match a little bit. So I'm going to take what I told you. I'm going to try on 2 for size, and let's see what that does for us. So option number 1, we go with our on-prem. We have our server, Active Directory, applications, everything the way I started. Maybe you're doing AD Sync because you're putting a little bit of an emphasis on the cloud. I'm not a fan. I don't get what the big plus to it is. But I know a lot of people do it. Maybe somebody can tell me that. SharePoint and or Windows File Server. So you have all the flexibility you want, right? There's no reason you can't use SharePoint. What are the pros? You could easily push out GPOs, everything that you could do on a server. You could host whatever you want locally, which comes with all the benefits. No recurring costs on the hosting. Everything low latency. And you could use OneDrive and SharePoint to collaborate and or to access your stuff from anywhere. So all those things, we said, what do you do if you need to share a folder with somebody externally? It's in SharePoint, assuming you're allowed to and you can share it. What happens if you go home? Maybe your files are on OneDrive. So you're still on your local domain, but you have a lot of that flexibility. What's the downside? You still need to buy a server. It still costs money to start up, and you're still kind of reliant on getting to that location, either logging in remotely, uptime. But at least if it's down, you have something. You can't go to sleep. You have your data, or some of your data, and for a lot of people, that might be enough for them. That's option number 1. Let's take one more. Let's say you take Azure AD. Okay, so we take our Windows 10 machines. They're Azure AD joined. You don't have a local server because you don't want one. You don't want one of those things in your office. You use OneDrive, SharePoint, whatever it is, but you run virtual machines in Azure. Okay, and you could even join them to your domain. The way that's done is with Azure AD Domain Services. It costs $110 a month, and you can join Windows servers to your Azure AD domain. Okay, so right now, a Windows server cannot be joined to Azure AD. It can only be joined to a regular domain. So a way around that is with this Azure AD DS, which obviously they play nice with their own. And if you're in Azure, it's very easy to connect. If you're not in Azure, you need VPNs. You can't do it unless you have VPNs or whatever. What are the pros? No physical servers. You have regular Windows server that you can run applications on or whatever else you want to do. Potentially, if you need, there's plenty of options for VPN straight to the cloud, site to site, point to site, whatever you need. You can, if you do that, you can connect your local infrastructure to the Azure AD, so you don't need domain controllers, right? They take care of that for you. And then the latest thing is Windows 365, which is basically Microsoft woke up and they said, AWS is killing us with these workspaces. We got to do it too. And they went one more and they changed their policy that they had for the last ever. And they decided that they can license their own Windows 10 machines in the cloud, which nobody else can do. So that's not so fair, but they make the rules. What are the cons? It can be pricey for smaller businesses because running virtual machines in Azure costs plenty. And you're still relying, I don't know how bad of a con this is, but you're relying heavily on cloud-based technologies and everything that comes with it. So you need techs with the proper skills. You got to know your way around the cloud a little bit. No access to local networks. You need your solid internet connection and so on. But here, at least, you're able to eliminate a single location. You're able to get a ton of flexibility while still having some virtual machines, some real servers that you can run as needed and everything that comes with it. You make it bigger if you need. You shut it down if you don't need. You make more, whatever it is. But again, it's still going to cost more. So let's look at what that costs, just that last option. Let's say we still have our business premium license, Azure AD Domain Services 110. And let's say you have one virtual machine, 8 cores CPU, 32 gig RAM, 1 terabyte SSD, with snapshots and whatever. It's going to cost you about $775 when I priced it out. So it's not that much of an upgrade. We went, I think, from $2,000 to $2,800, almost $2,900. But you get a lot of flexibility with this option. Here we just look at it one more time. So here you have when you're on-prem, whether or not you use SharePoint, this is your cost. It doesn't cost you more for SharePoint. It's already included in your license. If you're Azure AD with the virtual machine, it's $28.85, and then if you go down without any VMs, it's down to $2,000. So here you have kind of within the same price range, you have a bunch of decent options. One size does not fit all, and flexibility is key. This is the part where I give it a little teeny bit of musser. Techs like to stick with what they're comfortable with. They'll persuade clients to migrate to technologies best for the techs, not for the clients. And my example that I like to give is G Suite or Google Workspace and Office 365. So there are people, no matter what, eyes closed. If somebody comes to you and they have G Suite, you will tell them, okay, say goodbye. Into Office 365 you go. Now there are plenty of reasons to push that argument, but maybe they like it and they're perfectly happy with what they have. And I cannot tell you how many people have said exactly this to me. They say, someone moved us to Office 365. I don't want to talk about it. Why? Oh, it's a terrible experience. It's a little tricky, you got to calculate just a little teeny bit, it has to go smooth. And if you ask them, well, why do you do it? Because we use Office 365. Now, there's something to using what you know. I'm not going to, obviously, the techs need to be able to support what they know. But the lack of flexibility is what I'm trying to kind of point at over here. Okay? It's best if you could evaluate your client's needs and make the appropriate decisions based on what they're actually using, based on actually what they need, based on what they like, as opposed to where you decide everybody who comes my way has to use this. Now, a lot of people disagree with me, especially in the MSP world. Everything is modular. This is how we do it. Out with the old and with the new. This is what we use, and that's the way to have high volume. I can't argue with that point. But you can't forget that you're there to support them. So you got to think, we just went through several options. You got to kind of think about what makes sense. A lot of people, they're trigger happy. They say, okay, hey, cloud, into the cloud you go. Wait, why? Do I need it? Is it better for me? Everybody comes to the office. Nobody works from home. Or the opposite. What's wrong with you? Stay with it. And they're trying to tell you, I can't work this way. Half my people are not here. So you got to really try to be as flexible as you can. Be open-minded and try to do what they need. I'm gonna end off with a couple of real-world examples. So who does well with what? I picked a couple. In healthcare, I think they still do best with on-prem, mainly due to budget. They're always trying to keep costs to the lowest. Most employees don't need to access resources remotely. Think nurses, think CNAs. They come to work, they go home, and they don't think about work till they come back again. So the bulk of the workforce doesn't need it. They still do best on-prem, I think. Real estate. When I say real estate, I mean, you own 50 properties and you have little tiny offices all over the place. They do best with serverless. A lot of times they have many offices. All their work is cloud-based. They're rep manager this, that, whatever they're using. It's just much easier for them to be able to just not have to rely on a central location, and they don't need the cloud for anything. Business, think finance, think accounting. Businesses like that are the ones that will do best in the cloud. First of all, a lot of times they're ready to pay more. They have the resources to pay more. A lot of times they have their software that they use that needs to go on a server. They don't have the option of just being cloud only. And there's often a high, I'm generalizing here, but there's often a high ratio of employees that need easy access from anywhere. People travel, or put it this way, when the people go home or when the people go away, they're always online. They're always connected, and they always need to get in to where they're working. And the cloud is definitely the big benefit. I always tell people, I had a guy, he paid a ton of money to put things in the cloud. He didn't need to, but he wanted it, and he was able to pay for it. And one day he's sitting working, there was a blackout. His machine goes down. He was smack in the middle of I don't know what. Power comes back on. He logged right back into the server. He called me up. His cursor was still blinking in the same spot. He called me up to say, I was worth every penny. So, it's you gotta know your people. Just a final word on where this will all go. The trend has been the cost of the cloud is decreasing. Every time there's a change, the price goes down, not up. So it'll be more viable option to run VMs in the cloud. Right now, as I showed you, it's quite expensive. That cost is going down. I would love to see better options for syncing from cloud to on-prem. for now, it does exist. For the most part, it's the other way. If you're on-prem, you could push think ADC. You could push things to the cloud. What about when you're primarily based in the cloud, but you want to push your changes down? There's not a good option for that. That would allow things like Azure AD deployments for servers, which you can't do. You have a server 2019. You want to join it to Azure AD. You can't. Think about an RD gateway. Anybody use RD gateways here? You have an RD gateway and you want to use that for your Azure AD users. You can't. Without a lot of effort, which requires you to have an on-prem site with a VPN joined to Azure AD. It's just it won't. By the time you're done, it's just forget everything in the cloud. Everything in the cloud. Yeah. It's very, very complicated, and compared to doing it all on-prem, it's and then more robust, less buggy Intune and other newer technologies will be very welcome. We would love to see that. So that's it. You're done with me. Thank you very much. This is.